Today, we are going to be talking about probably the most important thing that you can do before League start to make sure that you have the best experience possible, and that is picking a build, evaluating whether or not that build is actually good for your purposes, and making sure that all the little nitty-gritty details are in line. This is probably the question that I get asked the most around this time. Hey, Big Ducks, is this build actually good? I see it on my Discord, I see it on my Twitch stream over at twitch.tv/bigducks, which you should go follow, by the way. I see it pretty much everywhere. People asking, hey, is this build good? Should I use this build? Should I use that build? Well, this video should be able to answer all of those questions and any other ones you have about whether or not a build is good just by looking at the path of building. So I am going to be using a Zizzarin POB because I know that there are going to be a bunch of new players, experienced players, and everything in between that will land on his builds for League start, and I know that Zizzarin won't care if I do. This is reviewing the Cold Dot Elementalist that was released for 3.21 over on Zizzarin's channel. We are going to be starting off this explanation with some things that more new players should be focusing on, or someone who has been gone from the game for some time. Maybe it's been a few leagues since you've played, you're coming back and you're a little bit confused. If you are a little bit more experienced player, or you think that you know enough that you don't have to worry about the basics, you can skip forward a little bit in the video. You should be able to find some timestamps and such below, but this is going to be the very basics on choosing a build for a very new player first, and we'll get into the more detailed stuff later. So if you are a very new player, or you're coming back after a while, things have probably changed. There has been a lot of hectic stuff going on in Path of Exile, a bunch of balance changes, the tree has changed substantially, ascendancies have changed, skills have changed, there's been a lot of new stuff. So if you've gotten to the point where you've opened up a path of building and you're feeling slightly overwhelmed on, I don't know anything that's going on here, I don't know if I should choose this build or that build, this skill looks cool, but is it actually fun to play? Is it worth doing this? Am I gonna suck? Is this build actually gonna be good? Well, let's start with the skill tree. If you are looking at a skill tree, typically for a newer player, you should be looking for something that's going to hold your hand a little bit. There is no shame in getting handheld in this game. It is very, very deep and very wide. This game is probably one of the most complex ARPGs, if not one of the most complex RPGs that has ever existed. So if you're looking at trees, you should be looking for something that is going to show you step by step where to put your points in. This is one of the more important things, because if you open up this POB, which is Path of Building, of course, and you see this tree and you are a very new player, you're going to be thinking to yourself, okay, so I start here on the witch and obviously I go out this way, but then I've got 3 directions to choose. Which one do I go first? You may have no idea. Now, typically, the answer that I would give someone if they're asking which way to go is you typically want to go for defenses first, meaning like life, energy shield, those kinds of things. However, I would suggest that you do find a POB that has leveling trees. If you look here, this is going to show you, hey, you should be coming up here, grabbing these nodes first. If you jump to the next little leveling tree here, it'll be like, okay, I'm supposed to go over to the right, grab all of these nodes. Next leveling tree is going to tell you, okay, come up here to the top. It also is probably going to tell you which ascendancy points to take first. So if you go into a path of building and it has all of these detailed leveling trees that tell you, hey, by the time you're at your 2nd lab, you can go here, 3rd lab, go here, so on and so forth, all the way to your in-game tree. That is a very important thing to think about if you are a new player. The next thing that you should be thinking about is how many skills and how many abilities is a build going to use. Now, this is the Cold Dot Elementalist, and I chose this build very specifically because it might fail this check for a very new player. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that the build is bad in any way. I'm saying that this may be something that you do not enjoy. Or if you want a more simple playstyle, something like this may not be up your alley. So the thing that you should be looking for is you should be seeing how many active abilities the build actually has. On Cold Dot, there are actually quite a few different abilities that you should be using. This build has multiple main abilities. It does have Vortex, which you can put on left click on this build, so that does mostly automate that. And then it also has Creeping Frost. These are your 2 main casting abilities that you're going to be using, as well as Cold Snap. So technically, this build has 3 main abilities. One of them, Cold Snap, has a Vol version of it, which is like an extra special, more powerful version of it, so that is another button that you have to press. This build also does have multiple curses to cast. It does have a movement skill, which all builds will have a movement skill if they're good at all. And then it does have a support skill in Frost Bomb. This is something that you'll use on top of a basically like more difficult enemy. So keep in mind, you might be pressing 5, maybe 6 buttons in this build. If that's not something that sounds good to you, if you want a more simple playstyle where you've just got maybe one ability, a debuff ability, and then like a movement skill, you may want to move away from a build like this. However, keep in mind that most builds these days in Path of Exile do use quite a few abilities. This is just kind of an outer case where it has a lot of abilities that it does have to press. And once again, lots of abilities does not mean the build is bad, it just maybe might mean that the build won't play well for what you're looking for. Now moving on to items, it is also very important that there are multiple item sets for a new player. And when you're looking at these item sets, if you go to the early leveling gear, it should be very basic. If they have super low level items, they should be like blues and rares. If they have like some stuff that you're going to be using around the beginning of the end game, they should have almost no stats on them. They should be mostly rare. You should see like 2 or 3 modifiers at most on the vast majority of these items for very early game items. One thing to keep in mind is that if you are seeing lots of these unique or orange items on a character, it doesn't necessarily mean that the build is bad in any way if you are a new player. It just means that these are items that you will have to trade for most likely, because you're not going to be able to obtain these super easily. So if the idea of trading with other people is maybe something that you really don't want to do, like you want to play solo self-found or something like that, or if you're just not ready to really trade very heavily with other people, keep in mind that a build that has lots of uniques, you will most likely need to trade them. This can also lead to situations where some of these uniques get extremely popular and can be very expensive or unobtainable for a new player. So if you see maybe 1 or 2 simple looking uniques, and the build has mostly other rares besides that in the early game, then you're most likely okay. But if you pull up a POB and it's literally got like almost all uniques and they look like they do very intense and crazy things, maybe go and ask somebody elsewhere, hey, is this build going to be good for League Start as a newer player? Because the answer is most likely no. Now, the last thing that you should be looking for, and this is a little bit rare even these days at this point, is to see if the build has any extra notes or it has a build guide video accompanying it that can answer some questions for you. Zizzarin in particular has always been very good about making sure that these sections are filled up with like frequently asked questions, how to level and all of that. I do this in most of my build guides as well, and there's a bunch of other content creators that do a very good job of this. However, there are some very popular content creators that do not do any hand-holding whatsoever. So keep in mind that if you pull up one of their POBs and it doesn't have all of this, it does not mean that the build is bad. It is just maybe going to have less information and less hand-holding that you probably are going to need as a very new player. So if you see things like this giant section here that has a bunch of questions answered, or it comes with an additional video that has some answers to questions and some more information, that is a good sign that the build is going to be something that you'll actually be able to figure out. So let's talk about some more specifics now. This is past the new player section. This is going to be talking about whether or not for a maybe a little bit more experienced player, or pretty much everyone, whether or not a build is actually worth your time. Now, there is one big and very important caveat that you need to keep in mind here when you're choosing a build. Different builds have different purposes. Not every single build is going to be an all-rounder that can do everything. Not every single build is going to have screen-wide, insane, crazy clear, and not every build is going to be able to farm Uber bosses week 1. These are not the same thing. There are some builds that can do all of these things, but they are very rare, typically highly meta popular builds that will require a ton of currency early on in the league. However, there should be some basic things that you're looking for. I believe that nowadays in Path of Exile, most builds should have a few very specific metrics that you should be looking for to evaluate whether or not it is worth your time. And those metrics are going to be how much damage does the build actually do, and whether or not that damage is clear damage or single target damage. The next thing you need to think about is whether or not it can actually sustain the mana to actually cast its abilities. If it costs like 500 mana per second and it's only got 40 mana and no way to recover it, maybe you should be a little bit careful about that damage number because it's probably not accurate. The next thing is, how does it fill those life bars? How is it replenishing life? How is it replenishing energy shield, mana, all those kinds of things? How is it making the little number go up to the big number? The next part is, how does it actually avoid damage? What sources of complete and pure damage mitigation does it have? And then lastly, how does it reduce damage that's coming in? If it does get hit, is it gonna die instantly, or is it going to be able to take at least one hit every once in a while? Now let's get a little bit more granular with these metrics. Let's talk about damage. Very, very early on in the league, your damage numbers are not that important. If a build is doing like 500,000 to a million DPS, that can carry you up through yellows perfectly fine and get you into some early reds and maybe even some later reds depending on the kind of build that you're doing, and be absolutely comfortable. However, you should be keeping in mind, if your goal is to move into some more in-game bosses, you probably are going to want those damage numbers to be a little bit higher in the in-game versions of the build. And if you're trying to push for Ubers this league, you really want those damage numbers to be higher to give you an easier time going through. Some base metrics that I would say is that for most builds, if it has 500,000 to a million, you should be okay with some basic mapping. If you're looking to get into some early end-game bosses, for a damage over time build, you should be looking at like maybe 1-2 million DPS. And then for a more hit build, you should be looking at like 2 to 3, maybe even 4 million DPS. The reason that there is a difference between a damage over time build and a hit build is that a damage over time build is going to have a significantly easier time actually hitting those DPS numbers and keeping them up. A build such as a Creeping Frost / Vortex cold damage over time build, you just pop all those abilities on the ground and then they just do the damage while you run around and avoid stuff. If you're playing a more hit based build, you're running around dodging abilities, and while you're doing that, you're not doing damage. So realistically, you're probably only doing half as much damage as POB says that you're doing. Now, if we're moving into more like very end game bosses, the more difficult ones, as well as some Ubers, you really should be having like 4 to 5 million DPS on a dot build and probably like 6 to 8 million DPS on a hit build. These are going to be some safer numbers to be able to get you through here. However, that being said, a higher number on these high-end bosses is always better because it just means that you're going to spend less time actually fighting the boss. Most of these Ubers specifically have abilities and mechanics where you simply cannot survive them if you get hit. So if your mechanics are not so good and your ability to dodge stuff isn't so great, you're going to want to pump those numbers up so that you can just kill the boss before it kills you. Another thing to think about when you're looking at the damage of a build is that if you jump into a build and just look at the top here, you'll notice that this build just says it does like 1.4 million DPS, but this is on in-game items with in-game skills on the in-game tree. That's not very much, right? Well, the thing about Path of Building is if you scroll down here to the bottom, keep in mind this build has multiple abilities that all do damage. The actual damage of this build is closer to 5.5 million DPS, and this is on dot damage. So if you remember when I said on an end-game build that's trying to do Ubers and such, if you're getting up to the like 4 to 6 million DPS on a dot build, you might be able to succeed relatively well with 5 to 6 million DPS. So do keep in mind, you have to pay attention to these full DPS numbers and think to yourself, am I actually going to be able to hit those full DPS numbers? If there's 4 separate abilities I have to keep up, am I gonna be able to keep up all those abilities at the same time? That's what you should be thinking. Now, if we're talking about sustaining your actual cost of using your abilities, this is very easy to tell with POB these days. You'll see that the mana cost of our main ability here, Vortex, is going to be 26 mana. If we check out Creeping Frost, it's 26 mana as well. So these two abilities each are going to cost 26. That means if you're casting them once, you're only going to spend 26 mana to cast it that single time. You only have to cast these abilities once every 4, maybe 5 seconds. So you've probably got an overall mana cost of maybe 30 to 50 per second. And if we scroll down here and look a little bit, we've got 12% of our mana that's unreserved, and that is 124 total mana. We are also regenerating 52 mana per second. So as long as we're not spending more than 52 mana every second, we are okay on mana. Now, there are going to be some builds that have alternative ways of casting their spells, meaning that some are going to use things like Eldritch Battery here, which means that you're going to be spending Energy Shield before your mana. So there may be a build that has a bunch of its mana reserved, but it does have a large Energy Shield pool. It's got a bunch of Energy Shield regen or Energy Shield leech, and that is the way that it casts its abilities. Alternatively, there is a way that you can use blood magic in this game to be able to cast your abilities off of your life total. So if a build is using some form of blood magic on some of its abilities or all of its abilities, then it is using its health pool to be able to cast. So it can reserve all of its mana, all of its energy shield can be used for other things. So just make sure that those numbers are able to sustain the abilities that you're actually casting, and you can check all of that through Path of Building over here on the left. Now, the third thing that we talked about is whether or not you can actually fill up your health bar, energy shield, mana, whatever you're using as your effective health pool layers. Can you fill those globes back up when they go down? Most of the time when you're doing this, you're going to be getting this through life leech, through life regeneration, a energy shield leech, energy shield recovery. You might be getting your health recovery through a life flask. You should just see if you actually have a way to fill those bars back up. This build in particular is going to be using an instant life flask, so when you press that button, it's healing you back up. It also does have a pretty decent amount of life regen here. That means that every second you're getting 250 life back. And then there are some builds that will like recover a certain amount of health on something happening, like blocking or such. So just check to make sure that there is at least some way to fill those bars back up. In general, builds that feel the best are ones that are going to be constantly refilling those bars very quickly and have a very easy source of refilling that bar. The next thing to check out is whether or not the build has some form of pure mitigation. That means that there is no damage being taken in some way. The main sources of this are going to be evasion and block. Nowadays, the vast majority of builds do have evasion. This is going to be a complete avoidance of an attack, meaning a ranged attack or a melee attack. If a build has, say, 75% chance to evade attacks, that means 3 out of 4 attacks will not hit the character. This does not help you with spells, but this does help you with attacks. As I said previously, another source of this is going to be something like block. Whenever you block, you take 0 damage from that hit, and there are chances for blocking normal attacks as well as spells. You can block both of them. So most solid, heavily defensive builds are going to have one or the other or some way to purely mitigate damage. Whether or not that's evasion, block, or something else, just make sure that it has at least one of those. Now, a character with just that pure source is still not going to be able to live permanently unless they somehow manage to get like 100% of those, which is very, very not common and typically pretty broken. It is also going to need some kind of way to be able to mitigate damage whenever it does take that damage. Now, there are a bunch of sources of this, but the main ones to look for are going to be armor. This is going to reduce just the raw physical damage that you take. There's going to be resistances, including increasing your maximum resistances. So nowadays there are a bunch of sources of maximum resistance heightening. So 75 is the basic max resist that you can get to. This can be moved up extremely high with certain gear or certain pieces or certain things taken on the tree. If it has a source of maximum resistance, that's going to lower the amount of elemental damage that you're taking. When it comes to chaos resistance, you should be trying to just get positive chaos resistance. It is very hard to get 75% chaos resist. This is a difficult metric to hit most of the time. If it's got like 30 to 50, it's probably going to be mostly fine. Now, on top of that, another very important defensive source is going to be spell suppression. And most importantly with spell suppression is getting 100% spell suppression. What this means is that every single spell that hits you is only going to do half damage. It will suppress it by 50%. This is a very, very powerful mechanic, and if a build has 100% spell suppression, you should expect that it is relatively tanky. And then of course, these are all of the defensive layers, and those modify your effective health pool. It is a combination of how much life you have, how much energy shield, life, or mana if you are using Mind Over Matter, combined with those reductions. So if you look here at the left, you'll see effective hit pool, Fizz max hit, Elemental max hit, Chaos max hit. These numbers are important to see how big of a hit you can take at one time. Now, do keep in mind, these numbers can be pretty heavily inflated depending on some certain things. For example, if you look here, Vol Molten Shell does not have either of these enabled, right? You don't see Enable Vol Molten Shell and you don't see Enable Molten Shell. If I click Enable Molten Shell, you'll notice that these numbers go way up, and you'll notice that if I click Vol Molten Shell, these numbers will go up even further. This is a very easy way for people to pad their builds. It is not expected to always have Molten Shell up. For any ability that you know is coming in, you should be clicking it or be using it on a cast when damage taken or be putting it on your left click. But do keep in mind, if a build has a ton of armor and they have Molten Shell clicked, these numbers are going to be heavily inflated. Now, those are going to be the main things that you're going to be looking at to evaluate whether or not a build is good. But there are a few other smaller things, but they are pretty important. However, there's no big section that I can put these in, so this is just going to kind of be a quick couple of different things to keep an eye out for. One, does it actually have the stats to use all of its abilities and use all of its gear? Keep a lookout to make sure that like the configuration doesn't have a bunch of added extra stuff in here, or if it does, that it's actually able to hit those things on its gear. If it's saying that you're getting like an extra, 100 all resistance, but it's using all unique pieces of gear, maybe it's not actually going to be able to do that. You should also do a quick check of these end game items that most builds have. A lot of people will put in some like Giga min-max gear in here, and if it doesn't say something like end game gear gear, right, then you should be probably a little worried if it's just saying like early budget gear, but it's got like a crazy like +1/+1 wand with some extra, you know, percentage multipliers on it and stuff like that. If the item looks too good and it's in a not super end game set of items, maybe be a little bit wary. Also take a look at the skills. A lot of builds are going to be using things like alt qualities that cost a lot, or maybe like level 4 empowers or enhances or enlightens and things like that. These are all hidden costs that you might not be aware of when you're looking at a build. So if you load up a build and it's got like a level 4 empower on it and you disable that empower and it loses half of its damage, be aware that if you can't afford that empower super early on in the game, you're not going to be able to do that kind of damage. So be aware of things like that. Another thing to keep in mind is in the configuration, if these boxes are checked, is it actually able to keep up those effects when it's doing a boss? If your goal is to kill a boss with this build and they've got power charges, frenzy charges, endurance charges checked, are they going to be able to keep up those charges on a boss? A lot of the time, the answer is no. So just do a quick check. If there's a bunch of things ticked in here and you don't think that the build's actually gonna be able to do it, like one in particular that you really should be careful of is when it says, is the enemy on scorched ground? There are a lot of builds that use this drop scorched ground while moving, lasting 4 seconds. If you don't know how to do that, keep that in mind. These are little things that are super important that change the amount of damage that these builds can do. If we go into configuration and we untick scorched ground, you'll see that the damage drops a decent amount. It goes from 5.5 million all the way down to 4.8 million. So if you're not going to be doing that mechanic, you know you won't be capable of keeping that up. Untick it and see how much damage you're actually going to be doing. One other thing to keep in mind is whether or not the build has a bunch of flasks activated. Now, typically, there are only a few specific circumstances where if you are fighting a boss that you can have all of your flasks up at all times. That is, if you're playing a build like a Pathfinder that has a ton of flask recovery where you're going to have those flasks up no matter what, or if the build does so much damage that it is killing the boss or whatever you're trying to fight in the amount of time it takes for those flasks to stay up. This is relatively rare, so most of the time if these flasks are enabled and you're wanting to figure out, well, is it going to do enough damage for the boss, you might want to untick these and kind of see what these numbers look like on the side. Because in particular with this build, these numbers still look pretty good, and then if you enable all of these, you'll notice that the numbers get significantly better. It has significantly more defenses, but these aren't always going to be up on a boss. So just make sure to double check those flasks. And while we're looking at items, also be careful of how deceptively expensive jewels can be. Very early on in the league, if you're seeing these like 3 or 4 mod jewels and they have a bunch of really crazy modifiers on them, you have to be careful because these can get giga expensive, especially cluster jewels. There are cluster jewels that can go up to multiple divines for one cluster jewel, and some builds use like 2 or 3, maybe even 4 of them. If you disable those things and the build just loses all of its damage, try to see if there are some other points or maybe a non-cluster jewel tree that you can use to account for that loss in damage, loss in effectiveness, and just make sure that the build isn't outside of your budget with any of those little sneaky things that they can really ramp up the cost with very quickly. And that is going to be it for the video. Now, if you've done all of that and you really still aren't sure, I do suggest that you try to go find a community of helpful people that will be able to guide you a little bit, but try to understand, no matter whether it's my community or someone else's community, if you go into their Discord, go into their Twitch stream, try to understand that they do answer these questions constantly. And if you kind of get maybe a little bit of an irritated answer, don't take it too personally. When you've answered the same question 100 times in one day, it does get a little frustrating. I personally am happy to answer questions whenever I can. So if you do want to just come and ask me specifically whether or not I'm streaming over my stream at twitch.tv/BigDucks or just in my Discord or anywhere else, I will be happy to answer them if I am available. If you really feel like you need specialty one-on-one help, I do have tiers available on my Patreon if you want to go and subscribe to that. I do have sections where I can help you out with specific things and give you some of my time, but do keep in mind, I value my time greatly. So remember, boys, if you enjoy this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Ray class, and I'll see you guys in the next video.